So we're here this afternoon at Holy Cross College with Dr. Alesha Seroczynski, who's a developmental psychologist and also works as a director of prison outreach programs at Holy Cross. And we're here to talk with Alesha in particular about Aristotle, moral development, and how Aristotle can help us design a better juvenile justice system. Because Alesha has worked to found a program called Reading for Life, which uses some ideas from Aristotle to try to do really practical outreach with juvenile offenders in St. Joseph County. So I was thinking, maybe just to start off, Alesha, you could tell us a little bit about the Reading for Life program and how it got started and what you guys do.
Sure. About 10 years ago, I had this idea that, ironically enough, Harry Potter could help juvenile offenders. I know it sounds crazy, but at the time, it seemed like a reasonable assumption. Everybody loved Harry Potter. Lots of kids were reading him who hadn't ever read books before. And there are a lot of great lessons to be learned in these novels. And I thought if we could take these lessons to the kids who need them the most, that is, kids who have become enmeshed in the juvenile justice system, then maybe we could help them lead better lives. That pilot project grew into other pilot projects, which grew into a really big venture called Reading for Life. Now we use a wide variety of genre, and we assess the kids' reading abilities so we know where they are, how well they read, and what kinds of books we should give them. And we also give them a lot of options at their reading level. We work in small groups with trained mentors, and we teach the virtues and let the kids read the books and try to find the virtues in the books and how they might apply the virtues to their own lives.
What's the goal that you guys are aiming for with this program, or has it changed since when you started the program to how it's implemented now?
No, the goal has always been the same, and that is that we could foster virtuous character development in these young people. We really wanted, instead of designing a punitive approach to juvenile justice, we wanted one that was restorative and even transformative so that they could develop better character and learn to make better life choices.
So what led you to Aristotle? I mean, I don't think a lot of people immediately make this connection that reading this long-dead Greek philosopher could somehow give us some insight into a major social problem, like how to provide opportunities to juvenile offenders. So how did you make that connection, and what led you to Aristotle as a philosopher that's useful in a project like this?
No, that's true, and especially not the kids in our program. When we introduce Aristotle, they're like, what are we talking about here? But when I first conceptualized this idea of taking novels to juvenile offenders, I knew that I needed a good theoretical orientation, and I was really kind of dissatisfied with the state of moral development in psychology. So I went to a philosopher friend and said, you know, hey, you guys have been thinking about moral development a lot longer than we have, and what's out there? And he introduced me to Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, and which I read voraciously, and immediately knew that I had stumbled upon, so to speak, a really great theoretical orientation for my intervention.
So I'm really interested in how this actually plays out. This is one of the topics that we've been going over and over and over again in the class, is how can reading these philosophers actually help us get new ideas about how to live our lives? One of the things that's really interesting about Aristotle compared with some of the other moral philosophers that we study is Aristotle is obsessed with this point of how to live, almost to the point of being confusing about how we'd actually apply it. So like Kant and John Stuart Mill, some of the other thinkers, they give you these broad theories. If you want to be moral, follow the categorical imperative, maximize utility. You read Aristotle, and he says, if you want to be moral, you've got to practice morality. You somehow have to develop the habit of knowing the right things to do when you find yourself in certain situations, the virtues. He thinks that becoming moral is a lot like becoming a great tennis player or becoming a really excellent painter. Like you start off and you're really lousy at it, but hopefully you have good people around to train you. And eventually you kind of get the knack, but you're never going to become a good tennis player or a good painter just by reading a book about tennis theory or painting theory. Mm-hmm. I wonder, do you follow that part of the spectrum for Aristotle? Do you think like he's really right, morality is the kind of thing that we just have to learn by jumping in there? Or do you think maybe there's more theory involved?
I actually think it's both. You know, I think we need to be very careful about creating the false dichotomy. And if you look at the state of moral development, when I, stumbled upon Aristotle, the big idea in psychology was really Lawrence Kohlberg's theories, his stages of moral development. And I don't disagree with really much of anything that Kohlberg proposes. I do think that, in early childhood, rules are important. And certainly, he's been criticized for a very deontological position, a very Kantian position of moral development. But then as we age, Kohlberg says that we need to be surrounded by, the social environment is important, surrounded by other people who are practicing morality, and then we will learn the rules of a society and begin to internalize those. But I think it's, his last stage of moral development where virtues can really, come into play, and that is we do need to be exercising or habituating the virtues. And probably, the first time we try out something like prudence, maybe we're not so good at it. But if we continue to practice prudence, then we will be very good at being wise. In Reading for Life groups, we talk about the importance of discipline. And most people, especially juvenile offenders, associate the word discipline with something negative. It's punitive. But we teach them the root of the word, which is really to be a disciple. And they learn over the 10 weeks of the program to bring themselves under the training or discipleship of the virtues. And they begin to practice the discipline of being virtuous. And in the process, then they can exercise those in their life, in real world settings, like when it matters, when they see someone being bullied at school or they have to walk away from a shoplifting incident or something like that. It's very difficult to exercise temperance and prudence and courage in those situations. But through the habituation, as Aristotle talked about, I think that they can.
How do you think literature fits in with this habituation? I think that's one of the most interesting dimensions of this program is we might think you learn to be virtuous by living out your life, but can literature help us pre-live experiences or get some kind of access, insight into what virtue is that we can't get in other ways?
Mm-hmm. I think literature is extremely important, especially when we don't have real life role models. We can begin to find those in story. And we also can, internalize some of the virtues that the characters are showing in the stories. So, for me personally, when I read To Kill a Mockingbird, I was overwhelmed by the character of Atticus Finch and really almost idealized him. But he was a very significant figure in my own moral development because I grew up in, a very racist South. And during desegregation, during school desegregation. And reading that one particular story was extremely important in helping me overcome some of the racism that I experienced as a child. And I think that many people will find that there is one or two stories that really have this significant impact.
I think this notion of finding exemplars is obviously huge for Aristotle, and it's really interesting to think of literature as providing possible moral examples in cases where they might be hard to find in our own community. But this is a tricky way of understanding Aristotle when it comes to moral examples. So on the one hand, Aristotle thinks he's really optimistic that all of us start off in life having the potential to become good people, to become virtuous people. But then he says, look, unless we grow up in a community or a family where we've got really good examples, it's going to be really hard for us to ever get there. It's hard on our own steam for us to discover what virtue is. And for people who end up being unlucky enough to be put in scenarios where they don't have really good examples, you could very quickly find yourself past the point of no return. I mean, if we think of being moral as being a habit, right, you can have good habits, but you can also develop really bad habits. Yeah. And if somebody develops a really bad habit, as any of us with really bad habits know, it can be really impossible to break. And Aristotle, even at some points in like book 3 of the Ethics, is like, if you go far enough down the road, there might be no turning back. I wonder if working with people in the juvenile justice system, you think you agree with Aristotle's pessimism about how hard it can be to break these bad moral habits when we get it, or if you think, actually our characters are a lot more flexible and fluid, and just as examples might come into and out of our lives in different ways, we can transform pretty flexibly.
Yeah. I actually think it's both and, not either or, but I think that comes from my, kind of own personal value system. I really don't believe that anyone is completely lost. On the other hand, I do think that the more embroiled you become in the juvenile justice system, the more difficult that it is, to get out of it. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, now I work with adult offenders, and almost without exception, most of the men we have in our college program have juvenile records. Many of them have been incarcerated since they were 14, 16 years old. That's pretty tough to break, and it takes a long time. That's not something that, a 10-week program like Reading for Life is going to ameliorate. On the other hand, the reason that I designed this program as a diversion program, which really means that they're diverted out of the court system, is so that we could catch kids when they pass through the doors of the Juvenile Justice Center the first time, not the 10th time. And in this way, we really kind of catch them when we still have the opportunity to instill the values that we want in them as a community. So no, I don't think anyone's completely lost, but I do agree with Aristotle that it's tough, and it takes a long time to overcome some of the oppression that we might experience in childhood. I think it drives us towards a greater compassion to people. When we look at another person and say, and can truly say, there but for the grace of God go I, then I think it really calls the best of us out and makes us want to be more compassionate to children and adolescents who haven't had the fortunate opportunities that the rest of us have.
An issue that comes up again and again when we talk about the justice system, both the juvenile justice system and the adult justice system, is the issue of personal responsibility. And you see this debate play out in public policy debates. So to what extent are offenders responsible for getting themselves into the system in the first place and should bear responsibility for that? And to what extent is it the system itself that brings people in? It's also really interesting that that same debate was a debate that philosophers like Aristotle and his contemporaries were having. To what extent are you responsible for the character that you develop? Is it the kind of thing that we can point to your community and your upbringing? That's really what turned you into the person you are. Or to what extent was it some particular choices that you made? Other philosophers that we've read in the class, especially Kant, think it has to be up to you for it to be morality. It's got to be all up to you. But one of the things that's cool about Aristotle is he says, he's kind of like, it takes a village. Like there's actually a lot of contributing factors that go in, and responsibility is a really complicated notion.
Yeah.
I wonder how you've thought about that, especially working with policy initiatives with this population.
Yes, responsibility is a complicated notion.
Yeah.
And there's no question, when we break the law, right? We broke the law. On the other hand, we can also think of situations where a person might break the law, perform an illegal action that might be extremely virtuous. Of course, instances during the Holocaust, immediately come to mind. But, we've had kids who've stolen food so they could feed their siblings because their parents were incarcerated or strung out on drugs. And it's really hard to fault a kid who steals in order to keep his siblings alive. So I think that responsibility is very complicated. On the other hand, I do think that there is a place, and of course justice is very important, but then if you look at Thomas Aquinas' extension of Aristotle's theory, there is a place where justice and love can come together. Mercy, we would say, and justice. And so I don't think that it behooves us to, have no flexibility in the criminal justice system and have no place for mercy. I think that we need to look at individual situations and determine, what is going to best serve this person and society and return this person to us more whole, better able to participate in the polis. Because a lot of people don't realize, but 99% of even incarcerated adults return to us. They're not locked away for life. We shouldn't. right? And we can't afford it, certainly as a society. So we do have to ask ourselves, what kind of person do we want coming back to us? And are we going to contribute to the virtuous character development of this individual, this child, this adolescent, or this adult? Or are we going to really just kind of heap coals and ensure, because we can ensure that a worse person comes back to us than went away. And I just think we can do better. I think we can all do better.
So if we wanted to take a virtue theoretic approach to issues like improving the justice system, which I think is really cool, one question you might have is, what virtues are the virtues that we should be aiming at? I mean, anytime you want to be a virtue theorist about something, you have this question about what are the real virtues and what are the ones, personality traits that just seem like virtues but maybe are not that important. Do you have an idea of like what are the key virtues we should be aiming at, especially if we're interested in trying to solve a complicated problem like how to better serve people in the justice system?
I'm a big proponent of the big seven. You know, Aristotle's 4 and Aquinas' 3, and I think they're all extremely important. For example, I think most people, when they look at the criminal justice system, might want to throw out something like faith or fidelity and hope, and yet these are extremely important virtues that we need to be helping people who are involved either in the juvenile justice system or the adult justice system develop. I mean, if they can't imagine a different possible selves, we would call it in psychology, if they can't hope about their future, then what future will they have except just to return, to a life of crime? And none of us want that. So I'm a bit reluctant to either say one is more important, because a lot of people think, justice, well, it's the most important. And yet, if justice isn't tempered by mercy, and even the Grecian statue of justice is blind to the individual and tries to exercise, justice and mercy simultaneously. And I'm just reluctant to throw any of them out. I think they're all extremely important if you think about the virtues individually, and how important it is for a judge to be prudent, for lawyers to be prudent, for us to be prudent when we're appointing public defenders, or the caseloads that we give to public defenders. They're exorbitant. Are people actually getting, a fair trial or, fair defense? I think any one of the virtues could be exercised in almost any component of the criminal justice system.
It's interesting because another way in which thinking about things in virtue terms is different from some of the other moral theories we've studied is virtue ethicists tend to be really focused on the particular circumstances of the event or case. This is something Aristotle also repeats to us over and over again, is you can't come up with just general rules that are going to cover every possible instance. You got to really dive into the particular situation you're facing. Do you think that's a kind of neglected virtue in some of the structures that you work with?
Well, sort of, except, I think a healthy society, and probably I would suggest, although I'm not the philosopher in the room, that Aristotle would agree that every society needs, rules or laws in order to maintain order, and that's very important, and the 10 Commandments are certainly a good place to start. I mean, I really don't believe that we should commit murder, I don't really believe that we should steal. I think those are important laws for any organized civilization. I do think certainly that there is a place for individual circumstances, and I've already described some of those to you. And I think that we can't be merciful or temperate or prudent without taking circumstances into consideration.
I think Aristotle would largely agree with that. I wonder, switching gears a little bit, so your training is in developmental psychology. I wonder to what extent you think that philosophy and psychology can learn from each other, and to what extent your interest in these philosophical views has helped you develop as a psychologist.
Yeah. Well, I'm an odd psychologist, admittedly so, but I certainly do believe that there is a place for philosophy and psychology. I mean, philosophy is our origins. This is our history. I think if you don't know where you've come from, you really can't know, where you're going. So obviously I think that the history of philosophy is extremely important in the training of all types of psychologists. But for me personally, I mean, obviously it's had a huge impact on my theoretical orientation toward my own research. And if you can see the books behind me, I read it a lot, and I try to read broadly, and I try to be conversant enough to have healthy conversations with all types of colleagues, and especially philosophers. And I'll put in a plug for my own association, the Association for Moral Education, which was actually founded by Larry Kohlberg back in the 70s. And it is a nice place where psychologists and philosophers and theologians and sociologists can come together, and all types of disciplines, anthropologists, and just talk about moral development today and moral development, across the history of humanity.
Yeah, it strikes me as well, certainly, if you find yourself sympathetic with Aristotle, who thinks that the virtues are personality traits, if you want to go any deeper down that road, you better start to have a theory about what a personality trait is. And that's going to just very quickly lead you into real academic psychology, and not just the kind of philosophical psychology of the Greeks.
Yeah. I was at a conference at Northwestern, and they were talking about another aspect of like music and musicology and Aristotelian ethics, and I was struck by the way that the philosophers talked about Aristotle like he just died yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, they talk about him like
He's dead?
Yeah, exactly. And they were actually talking about testable hypotheses and some things that we have actually, as psychologists, have studied.
Yeah.
In music and music theory, and the way music affects learning. And, I'm sitting at the back of the room watching all these philosophers talk about Aristotle like really like he was still alive, and as though nothing had happened since he lived. And it was really hard for me to not raise my hand and say, we studied that, and, here's what we know. And I do think that if philosophers spent a little more time kind of in some of the specific areas of research that we've done that relate to any of the theories of philosophy. But also, I mean, I think the reverse is true. If psychologists spent a little more time reading the philosophers, because the ideas are so rich and can, I think, truly impact the way that we develop our testable ideas, I think both disciplines would be richer.
I absolutely agree. I mean, Aristotle, he was a philosopher, but he was also a social psychologist and very much interested in doing the kinds of research that psychologists and social scientists do now in his own time.
I think his ultimate goal was, to develop a good polis, and isn't that what we're all after? Don't we want a better society?
Yeah. And seeing that there's some kinds of community responsibility for a lot of these issues.
Right.
One final question, maybe a bit cheeky to end it. So somebody who's deeply interested in the virtues and the vices, what do you think is the most neglected of the modern virtues, or the most neglected virtue in modern society, if you had to take a stab? One you'd at least like to promote.
That's really tough. But, given that it's the day after Easter weekend when we're recording this, and everything that we've talked about, I think that if we don't develop more love, if we don't develop more compassion for humanity, then we won't be a society worth continuing.
Yeah.
I think that's the most neglected one. I really do. And I think that it would drive all the others if we had more love, really, truly, deep, heartfelt love for other human beings. I think all of the other virtues would just fall right into place.
Socrates and Plato were both interested in this idea that really there is probably just one master virtue that we need to learn. So maybe we can put up love as a candidate for that.
Okay.
Aristotle was a little skeptical. He thought they were more divisible. But
maybe he was right. It's tough. It is tough to pin down one, but that's the one I'm going with today.
Fair enough. That's a good camp to be in, I think. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. This is really interesting and very helpful in our project to try to understand how Aristotle fits into some big issues.
Thank you. Thanks. I enjoyed it.